Welcome back. Panelists here. Hugh Hewitt, host on the Salem Radio Network. Former Maryland Congresswoman Donna Edwards. Carol Leonnig, national political reporter for The Washington Post. And Phil Rucker, the Washington Post White House bureau chief. And Carol and Phil's new book is A Very Stable Genius, Donald J. Trump's Testing of America. It comes out on Tuesday. Excerpts have been floating around quite a bit. You guys have gotten quite a bit of buzz here. Congrats on that. I want to get to sort of how the book and impeachment converge here a little bit. But Donna and Hugh, I want you guys to deal with this statement from the president's legal team. It's not the legal response yet. This is the summons. House Democrats' abuse of power claim, the articles of impeachment are constitutionally invalid on their face. They claim they fail to allege any crime or violation of law whatsoever, let alone high crimes and misdemeanors as required by the Constitution. Now, Hugh, you're a lawyer. Technically, this sentence is not accurate. I mean, the House impeached. Whether you may not like what they did, but it is it's constitutionally valid. You just may not like what they did.
I think they were trying to convey exactly that. I read last night the House manager's trial memorandum and their entire statement of material facts. I do not believe they have presented a case that rises to the level of an offense that is impeachable, much less any offense at all. In fact, I looked at, with a little bit of stunned amazement, at Material Allegation 73, which is on page 25 of the second submission, in which they contradict their own allegation, which is at the beginning, the president was attempting to influence the 2020 election. They cite in their own statement of material facts, it was about the 2016 election, a Volcker to Yermak text. So I spent a lot of time on this last night. I don't think we're going to get the witnesses now. They do not have a case, and on Article 2, I think it is absolutely silly. There was no offense, no impeachable offense.
Don Edwards, is that how you see it?
Well, it isn't how I see it at all. I'm a lawyer, maybe not as good as Hugh, but my reading of the House's brief is that they state really clearly, I think, a strong constitutional argument in the beginning of the brief that lays out the history of impeachment, really reminding us that high crimes and misdemeanors was left to the definition of the legislators. It doesn't mean, the breaking of a law. And they talk specifically about the abuse of power allegations, and that the abuse of power is exactly the kind of abuse of public trust that the founders had in mind. And so I think it's a really strong and compelling argument. And the question is whether there's going to be a fair trial so that Democrats can really present the argument against the president.
One quick question on the obstruction article. In hindsight, should they have either waited longer to file that one and fought in the courts, or used Mueller's obstructions to strengthen that article?
No, I actually think that the article is strong on its face with the evidence. Would it have been bolstered if witnesses were not obstructed by this president of the United States and prevented from giving testimony? Would it have been bolstered if documents were produced? No documents have been produced to the House of Representatives. And so I think that they made the case that they could. And now it's really important to focus on what kind of trial this is going to be and whether it's going to be the kind of trial that the American people expect.
The wild card in this trial, guys, is the fact that unlike the Clinton impeachment, there's new characters, new information, and that's what this week has. Here's one of the potential new characters, Lev Parnas.
President Trump knew exactly what was going on. He was aware of all my movements. I wouldn't do anything without the consent of Rudy Giuliani or the president.
Okay, you guys have covered this, not just in the book, very well. Phil, Carol, Phil, start with you. Lev Parnas, how's the president handling somebody who's now another person who's turned on him?
It's like Michael Cohen, the president's personal attorney, turning on the president. Lev Parnas is somebody who tried so hard to get into the Trump orbit. There are photos all over the internet of him posing with the president, with his allies at Mar-a-Lago, at different fundraisers. A lot of thumbs up. And now he's turning completely. He's providing this new evidence, those notes that were scribbled on the hotel stationery. And he wants to tell his story. The question, I think, becomes whether the Senate Republicans, enough of them, want to hear witnesses to bring him forward. And importantly, John Bolton, the former national security advisor, who has said he'd be willing to testify if asked.
What do you make of the president's relationship now with Rudy, if the people Rudy was bringing into this thing are now causing political problems for the president?
From our reporting, it's really shocking. Inside the White House and the president's closest confidants are all saying, oh my gosh, where has Rudy led us, essentially. He wanted to be Secretary of State, and he was essentially operating as a Uber Secretary of State, going around the country, making some money, and also trying to do things that leading our foreign policy. Now there are advisors to the president who say he led us down a path that really makes the president vulnerable.
Hugh, why isn't there more anger at Rudy? I'm surprised there isn't, because do you think we'd be here without Rudy Giuliani?
No, but I also believe there's no much anger at Rudy because not anyone on my side of the aisle believes that an impeachable offense occurred. And I can't stress this enough, and you're onto it with your question about Article 2. This is about future presidents, not just President Trump. Not only do I think he did not commit an impeachable offense or any offense, I'm also concerned that this rushed job, especially on Article 2, is a horrible precedent for future presidents. And when the issue of witnesses comes before the Senate this week or next, I think a lot of Democrats may be tempted to vote on behalf of future presidents.
But what's the worst precedent? Going back to abuse of power, Donna, what's the worst precedent? I mean, if the president doesn't believe what he did with Ukraine is wrong, then future presidents may do the same thing.
Well, I think going back to the Constitution and the framers, this is exactly the kind of violation of public trust, and particularly around foreign interference in an election. We had come off of a king. We didn't want that. We wanted a democratic republic. And what the president has done really goes right squarely at his constitutional responsibility in making sure that there's not foreign interference in our elections.
You know, it strikes me, and your book, I think, chronicles this well, and we're going to get to some more of the excerpts a little later in the show, but do you think, Carol and Phil, that the president would be here if his first or second teams were still around him in the West Wing?
You know, what we found in our reporting is that the guardrails are gone. The trajectory of this presidency is escalating towards a presidency of one. More chaos, less discipline in decision making. The people who tried to hem him in, they're out. He drove them out of the room, and he has mostly a lot of people around him who view themselves and their mission as telling him yes.
Is there anybody left? Not a single person left that tries to restrain?
You know, the people in power left, like Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, Mick Mulvaney, the acting chief of staff, they see their job as trying to get the president to a yes, of executing what he wants done in a way that they can defend publicly and in a way that is somewhat legal, but they're not trying to challenge him. They're trying to execute his orders and placate his conspiracies to some degree.
I have to disagree. You had Robert O'Brien on last week, Secretary Pompeo the week before. These are strong individuals who will tell the president no when they think he is doing something wrong. I completely reject the idea that Team 3, which this is somehow less able to tell the president hard facts. In fact, I think Team 3 is the best team he's had.
But Hugh, what about the part where Mick Mulvaney agrees to withhold the aid, which turns out to be against the law, the aid to Ukraine?
I don't know that it is against the law. I don't believe that to be the case. I don't think they made that case in the House
Well, the
Manager's
Government
brief.
Accountability believes that it was
The
against the law.
GAO does. It's an arm of Congress, but I do not believe that has been shown in the manager's brief.
All right. Congress is part of the government, too. I mean, they're allowed to make laws as well. All right. We're going to pause it here. Hello from Washington. I'm Chuck Todd, and thanks for checking out the Meet the Press channel on YouTube. Click on the button down here to subscribe, and click over here to watch the latest interviews, highlights, and other digital exclusives.